You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Christian kicked off flight after bragging she preaches to captive audience, based on an article by Sarah K. Burris. A captive audience is not consent. Whitney Lynn was removed from a flight after turning a confined cabin into a stage for her own religious performance, then trying to recast the consequence as persecution. The reporting is useful because it shows the actual chain of power. A passenger decided to ignore the basic social contract of air travel. Flight attendants enforced it, and police explained an obvious rule she kept pretending not to understand. She had attention, not authority. The central fact is not that Lynn preached. It is that she weaponized the impossibility of escape. She said the passengers were the perfect audience because they had no choice, and she treated that lack of consent as a feature, not a violation. That is not evangelism in any morally serious sense. It is coercive performance dressed up as conviction. Airplanes are not public squares. They are regulated spaces governed by crew instructions, seat belts, and federal rules against disruptive behavior. The people with institutional authority were the flight crew, the airline, and then police. Lynn had none of it. What she had was access to other people's time, patience, and inability to leave. Persecution is doing a lot of work here. Lynn's self-presentation depends on a familiar piece of grievance theater. Break the rules, trigger enforcement, then claim the enforcement proves you are righteous. She was escorted off the plane after escalating the conflict, and she immediately tried to convert that removal into evidence of spiritual martyrdom. That frame is not accidental. It is a political habit as much as a religious one. Deliberate disruption gets laundered into victimhood. Accountability becomes oppression. A basic response to misconduct gets inflated into a story about censorship, hostility to faith, or persecution of Christians. The result is a neat inversion. The person creating the problem becomes the injured party, and everyone forced to absorb the spectacle becomes the aggressor. The racism was not a side note. Lynn also lashed out at one of the people escorting her by questioning whether he was from Puerto Rico because she could not understand him. The detail matters because it exposes what kind of entitlement sits underneath the unjust sharing the gospel routine. The same person demanding a captive audience also felt licensed to reach for xenophobic contempt when challenged. This is not a misunderstanding about tone. It is a revealing collapse of piety into status aggression. The performance of moral certainty does not prevent ordinary prejudice from surfacing. Often it gives it cover. Content first, conviction second. Lynn's videos, the Post noted, drew more attention than usual after this incident. That is the uglier engine behind the whole episode. The point is not simply to preach. The point is to manufacture a confrontation that can be clipped, posted, and recirculated as proof of one's own importance. That is why the language is always inflated and the stakes are always cosmic. Spiritual warfare is useful because it turns any pushback into evidence that the performance is working. The camera matters. The audience matters. The conflict matters because it generates the content. The actual passengers who did not opt into any of this are treated as props. Consent still means something. The priestly fantasy here is that a person can force truth on strangers because they're physically present and cannot leave. That is not moral courage. It is a cheap substitute for persuasion. The pastor quoted in the reporting gets closer to the real issue. Faith without relationship or permission is not witness, it is intrusion. The police officer's explanation was simpler and more accurate. Arguing with flight attendants gets people removed from planes. In a functioning order, that should not be controversial. The fact that Lynn tried to turn ordinary enforcement into a persecution narrative shows how badly some people need to confuse consequences with oppression. The pattern beneath the performance. This story is not really about one preacher on one flight. It is about a broader political and cultural style that thrives on boundary breaking, then hides behind victim language when boundaries are enforced. It depends on spectacle, contempt for consent, and the assumption that other people's discomfort is just raw material for one more self-justifying broadcast. The lesson is not that faith is the problem. The problem is the authoritarian habit of treating unwilling people as an audience to be captured, corrected, and sold back to themselves as proof of virtue. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article. With the automated voice of Cusel, thanks for listening.